everyone, thank you for joining us for the end of year pensions process webinar discussing how to submit Type 2 self-assessments in PCSE Online. My name is Debbie Roberts and I will be facilitating this evening's session. Okay, so just to let you know who you've got on the call this evening. So you have Katrina, who's the PCSE Senior Stakeholder Relationship Manager, who's going to be running through all the pension slides. And then you've got myself and Kat, who work in the communications team. Okay, so just a quick look at the contents then. So we're going to start off by having a look at the employee contribution statement and where you can find that. We'll be discussing tier rates and how you can calculate them correctly. We'll then go on to a system demonstration and talk you through PCSE Online and how you can submit your Type 2 form. And then we will end on questions. Okay, so making a start then with the employee contribution statement, I'm now going to hand you over to Katrina.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining. It is a small group this evening. As you'll be aware, the Type 2 form was published at the start of the year by NHS Pensions, and the official deadline for submission was the 28th of February, but we have now been able to put the form retrospectively on PCSE Online. So we've set this webinar up really for anyone who hasn't been able to make that deadline for whatever reason, hasn't already submitted their 23-24 Type 2 form. There are quite a number of thousands of GPs who haven't done that yet. So now that we've got the solution available online, then we wanted to take the opportunity to walk through it and show people how easy it is to use. And as Debbie said, just answer any questions that anyone might have in relation to that. So we do thank you for taking your time to join us. I'm just going to start with the PCSE Online Employee Contribution Statement before we jump into the Type 2 form. Okay, so you should be able to see the PCSE Online screen visible to you now. So this is what you'll see when you log into PCSE Online and you click the GP Pensions button. Different users have a different array of buttons depending on the sort of permissions that you have. But you'll have, as a GP, you would have the Employee Contribution Statement button as one of your on-screen choices. So if we click that, so Debbie mentioned about test data. I've been logged in here as a fictitious practitioner just for the purposes of demonstration. So this is all totally fabricated data. But when you log in, you'll see that the screens populate with your own details. So things like your GMC number, your name, etc. So you've got all of that already. Whereas on the paper form, you need to start filling all that in yourself. So when you're in the employee contribution statement screen, then you would select the financial year. So we're focusing on 23-24, and then you can simply click search. Now, this system can be a little bit slower than the live system just because of the way that test environments work. But we'll see that all of the different pensionable incomes and contributions that my test GP has had over the course of the year are all now showing in month order on the employee contribution statement screen. And if we scroll down to the bottom, then we can see that this is the total pensionable pay, total employer and total employee contributions that we have on record for this GP. If the GP had any ABCs, then we would also have that populated in that column too. So when we think about how these contributions get into, or the contribution data gets into the PCSE system, if we start with the locum work, so what you can do is you can filter that. So you can just go to click locum, click search, and our GP here has done some locum work in 3 of the months throughout the year. So it's recorded the income and contributions that the GP has had, and they get into the system by means of the GP submitting the locum A and B forms to PCSE. Lots of GPs use PCSE Online now to submit these forms direct, but some do submit them in through the Contact Us form. When they come in, they need to be matched up to the payments that the GP's made to NHS England's bank account. That's all done by the PCSE agents, and the information, when it's confirmed, then automatically populates onto this screen on a month-by-month basis. So as a GP, I can, throughout the course of the year, go into this employee contribution statement and, allowing for the 3-4 weeks kind of processing window for locum forms, for example, see that then, the work that I've submitted for June, if I've submitted those payments in July, then by the end of August or whatever, I'll be able to see that on my employee contribution statement. And then when it comes to the end of the year, then all of the contributions for any locum work that I've done will be displayed on here. So it's really just to explain how rich the information is that's available now, that you can actually see, as the year goes on, and then at the end of the year or after the pension year has finished, to help you, just make sure that the form that you're about to submit for your self-assessment has got all of the correct information. So that's our locum work. This GP also did some solo work, so if we filter on solo instead, then we can see that we've got the total income from the solo, the employee contributions, etc. Now, sort of top tip, if you do any solo work, is when you do that filtering and you can see your solo earnings, check that against the annual solo form that the provider that you worked for should have completed. An annual solo form, got you to sign that, which is the total of all of the solo pensionable income and contributions for the year. It's a requirement by NHS Pension still that that's completed, and they're now asked to provide that to yourself to submit to PCSE, really just to make sure that all of the data has made its way through, because depending on whether you've worked for an NHS England region as an appraiser for solo, if you've worked for an ICB as a clinical lead for solo, or if you've worked for an out of hours provider for solo, then the route as to how this data gets into this system and onto your PCSE record is a bit different. So checking against your annual solo form before you submit your end of year type 2 form is a good tip. And then the final bit, of course, is our monthly salary from the practice post as a salaried GP. So if we filter on that, so this particular GP has worked at one individual practice for the whole year, and these monthly contribution lines come about from the annual estimate that the practice has submitted for the GP at the beginning of the year. So if we think about it, this particular scenario, the practice has estimated that I'm going to earn £48,000 for the year, and they have said that my tier rate is expected to be 9.8%. So the PCSE system on a monthly basis divides that 48 by 12, so says it's £4,000 a month. What's the 9.8% of that? That's the employee contributions that get deducted from the practice, and then what's the employer rate, times the monthly income, that's the employer contributions that get deducted directly from the practice. So when it comes to the end of the year, what the system is telling us on the employee contribution statement is that this is what the practice has paid over already, but that's as a result of the annual estimate that they submitted for me. Now, as a GP, I'm on the payroll as a salaried GP, and my pay slips tell me what I've actually had deducted from me. So when we come to the type 2 form, then there's really two different sets of figures that are relevant, and one set of figures is relevant to me as a GP. That's what I've actually paid to the practice, and whether that turns out to be or paid through the practice through payroll, it's whether that turns out to have been the correct amount or I've over or underpaid. And then separately, PCSE will calculate with the practice whether they've paid over the correct amount to NHS pensions through this estimate process, and they will arrange those adjustments if anything's necessary. So I think it's just helpful to understand where this all comes from. I should have said at the beginning, we completely and fully aware that the type 2 process and the end of year reconciliation, it's a painful piece of admin that it's not a popular thing, and that there's a lot of kind of effort that people need to do to go into that. But clearly, where PCSE are is sort of we've got to do the processes and follow the processes as per NHS pensions directions. And what we're trying to do with the PCSE system is make it a little bit easier for GPs to sort of navigate this what is a a compulsory mandatory end of year process to do. So we're looking at the ways that we can make it easier, but giving you full visibility of all the contributions and an understanding of how the data gets into the system hopefully helps. So that's probably all I was going to say on the employee contribution statement. I think we were going to just touch on tier rates now. If we just go to the first slide. So again, range of people with a range of experiences probably on the call, but it's just worth recapping that it's that pensionable income that we arrive at the end of the year, taking into account all of the practitioner roles that a GP has had, that then determines what the correct actual tier rate is for the year. And that can be quite difficult to, kind of guesstimate, I suppose, at the beginning of the year for a GP. There's a tier rate. The tier rate table is on the slide here, just to show you, but the tier rates can change on a yearly basis. They don't change every year, but they have changed a lot over the last few years as NHS pensions have made changes. But the important thing really is that if it is that such that you've sort of been on a lower tier rates throughout the year because you were thinking your earnings were going to be within a certain tier rate band, so the practice has said, well, that looks like 9.8, and you've said you're out of hours provider, I think I'm going to be in the 9.8 bracket, because those providers don't know all the different roles that a GP has, so they have to be guided by you. Your locum forms, you might say, yeah, I think I'm going to be on 9.8, so I'll pay at 9.8. And then when it gets to the end of the year, if it turns out that you kind of earned more that's taking you into a higher bracket, then it does then mean that there are shortfalls to be resolved for the various roles that you have, and we can go into how that works. If, on the other hand, it's the opposite way around and you think, right, I think I'm going to earn something in the region of 80 or 90,000, so I've got everything set at 13.5, and then your circumstances change throughout the year and it turns out that you're maybe 50,000 in a kind of 10% bracket for that year, then you've overpaid, and there are processes to work through all of that and make sure that you get the amounts refunded back to you that you are due. And the other thing to highlight is that when you have been or had any sort of practitioner income for the full year, then your tier rate is based on your annual income, and that's all you need to, or the total annual income, and that's all you need to be concerned about. But if you've only been a practitioner pension scheme member for part of the year, so perhaps you were a registrar for the first few months of the pension year, and then you became a salaried GP in September or something like that, it's the registrar contributions are treated as officer and they don't get included in the Type 2 form. But what you do need to do is use the NHS pensions annualisation calculator to determine what the annualised tier rate would be for you for that year. So this example, when you go to the NHS pensions website and you can download the annualisation calculator, there's a different one published for each year. So if we're doing 23-24, make sure you use the 23-24 calculator, and you enter the start and end date of the employment, and you might have multiple, and you can add multiple rows to this calculator. But this is a simple example where the GP has started on the 1st of July as a Type 2 GP, and they have ended that on the 28th of February. They've decided to do something different. So the pensionable pay for that period was £42,500. When we put those dates and that amount into the calculator and just click the calculate button, then that comes out with an annualised pay of 63,837. So if we look at that on the table, then the 63,000 odd takes us into the 12.5% bracket that we can see on the table there. But the mistake that some people make when they don't realise in the scenario that they needed to annualise is they understandably kind of look at the 42,500, look at the table and say, right, that takes me in, I think it's 9.8, it's a bit small, isn't it? But that takes me into 9.8. So it is important, but it only applies if you have either, started or ended as a practitioner partway through the year, had a big gap in the middle or something like that. Then that's, if you're continuous, then that's where your total pensionable pay is just your total annual income, and you use the table to look up the correct banding. But if you've in this kind of partial year scenario, then you need to annualise it. So this one is where we've got a bit of the GP from September through to January has had a type 2 post, so they've been a salaried GP for a little period, and then they've moved on to do some locum work. And for your locum work, you need to record the start and end date of each period of work, and that's an NHS pensions rule. That's not something that we're able to influence, but if that's one day, like the 12th of February for a practice, then that's recorded as the one day. If that's a few days period of work, then the few days, and the pensionable pay for the few days is recorded. So it can feel quite cumbersome, but that's the calculator that NHS pensions have published for people to follow. So this is what you would use to annualise your income, but only if you've not had continuous type 2 or continuous practitioner work. Even if you've been type 1 then type 2, or type 2 then type 1, you still had continuous practitioner work. But if you've been an officer, or you've switched to an officer post, started working for a trust or something like that, university, academic posts, those kind of things, they're all officer posts, and they do not get declared on the type 2, they don't get taken into account for the calculation of your tier rate. PCSE don't administer the contributions for any of those posts, and it can be a bit confusing, but that's just the pensions rules, I'm afraid. So purely the practitioner work, and only needing to worry about annualising if you've not had continuous practitioner posts for the full year. So hopefully that helps. So we're going to, I think, move straight on to the actual type 2 form. Okay, so our GP is going to go to the self-assessment type 2 screen, and we're going to click self-assessment. And this will bring up the first tab of the type 2 form, and it auto-populates with the GP's details, so we don't need to worry about any of that. What we do need to do is select the financial year. The test environment makes it look like 24-25 there, but it's not, it's only 23-24. So we've got 23-24 selected. This will then populate with the practices that we have salaried contributions for. So if I had worked at more than one practice as a salaried GP, there would be multiple rows here. The fact that I've worked at my solo organisation, out of hours provider anyway, and I've done locum work, we don't need to worry about that for this first part. We'll see this when we go on to the second tab. But if we do need to look up any organisations, if they're not showing on the form for a practice I've worked at, then we can enter the organisation information and search for that. But the couple of key questions that are on the first tab of the type 2 form are if I've had any authorised leave, so paternity, maternity, adoption, sick leave. If I say yes to that, then what the system says is it will force me to complete the authorised leave tab. So it auto-populates that, and it will force me onto that later on. But if I say no to that because I didn't have any authorised leave, then the other question that's been added for 23-24 by NHS Pensions is, did I have an added years contract? If I say yes to that, then the system would populate with the relevant percentage, but I've clicked yes, and the system knows that I didn't have an added years contract, so it's telling me that I've clicked the wrong button essentially. So I go back to no, and then it's happy again, and all I need to do is click save and next. So this takes us on to the main tab of the type 2 form, and you'll see that you've got the option, or the requirement really, to select the tier rate at the top, but we just need to consider that and check that we've got all of the actual pensionable pay figures in our form before we then select that tier rate. So if we think about, let's do it back to front again. Let's start with the locum work again. So the locum row in row 5, the system has populated with the locum income that it has recorded for me from my locum forms. It's also populated with the employee contributions that I've already paid over to NHS England, and I paid those contributions based on the 9.8% that I had estimated that I was going to be on. We ignore column B and C for the moment until we've selected the tier rate, and we'll come back to them. But those figures, so I'm happy that that's the locum income and the contributions that I've already paid. The solo work that I've done in row 3, then again I've checked my annual solo form, and I'm happy that that's the full amount of pensionable pay from the solo work, and I'm happy that this is the 1,715 is the amount of contributions from the solo work from my employee contributions, again according to my annual solo form, so I'm happy with that. But again, I need to think about that was based on the 9.8% that I had advised my out of hours provider that I thought I should be on. But then our main practice income that we said was based on the estimate of 48,000. When I look at my pay slips, if I look at the final pay slip and say, well, actually that is often a little bit different depending on any increases or, you know, extra hours that I've done during the year. So it's actually 51,500. And from my pay slips, I can see that I've paid already 5,047. So that's the amounts that I've taken from my pay slip. So I have that information obviously at my disposal because they're from my own pay slips. I've got the information about my solo work either from my pay slips or from my annual solo form, and I've got the information from my locum work. It's the system has populated these figures for me, but I'm able to verify that by looking at my locum records that I've submitted. So what we can see there is the box 6, which is the total pensionable pay for me for the year, has now changed because my estimated income for my practice that the practice submitted was a little bit lower than what my actual ended up being. So this 79,400 is the figure that we need to then take the tier rate derivation from. So what I can do on PCSE Online in the live system, and I think in the test system, is I can click the tier rate table and get it to populate. If I just scroll that down a little bit, then I can see that I'm now well above the 13.5% bracket, but you've got the full table for each of the years on the system. So all I need to do now is select the 13.5%. And what you can see is the system will then do the calculations automatically. So if I start with my practice income this time, what that calculation has done is said, right, okay, 13.5% times the 51,500, that's telling me what the value of the employee contributions that I am due to pay on that particular role. And it looks at what I've recorded as that I've already had deducted through payroll or from my pay slips, and it tells me that I've got a difference of £1,905.50 to talk to the practice about. So in this instance it's a shortfall, so I need to talk to the practice about how they're going to collect that from me. If it's an overpayment, then I need to talk to the practice about how they're going to refund that to me. So that gives you there that calculation, and you can, we'll see at the end, you're able to take a copy of this or show it to the practice. You know, keep a copy for your records, but show it to the practice so they can see where that calculation has come from. Box 2C is there just for PCSE's purposes. We'll see it's auto-populated by the system. You don't need to do anything, you know, in regards to that. And when this form gets submitted to PCSE, what the PCSE system will be doing is saying, well, actually the amount that's due, so the 13.5% times 51,500 minus what the practice is paid over, then we PCSE collect from the practice the difference between those two figures. As a GP, you don't need to worry about that too much. That's PCSE's job to sort that out with the practice. But what the Type 2 form in PCSE Online does now is it then clearly defines what this 2B, the figure that populates in 2B, is the figure that as a GP you are interested in, because that's the difference between what you have had paid or had deducted through payroll and what you need to when the full actual pension year is taken into account. So that's the bit of interest really. So that's our practice work. When we look at the solo work, then this solo work, there's quite often a zero in this calculation. There's quite often no difference. And if I had been paying contributions through my solo provider at 13.5%, then it would have come to zero, because the solo doesn't vary. It's calculated on a month-to-month basis. It's not an estimated income, so that should be correct. But in this instance, because I've been paying at 9.8%, then the system then looks and says, okay, that 13.5% times the 17,500, we now have this difference that I need, or that needs to be paid by the solo provider. Now, this is where, and I'm not sure how many people on the call actually do solo work, so we can probably come on to that in the Q&A, but this is where it will depend on the solo work, or the type of work, sorry, that you're doing. So if you work as a solo appraiser for an NHS England region, then there is one process for collecting arrears or sorting out overpayments. If it's an out-of-hours provider that you work for, then there's a slightly different process, again all determined by NHS pensions / NHS England arrangements. And then there's a third process if you happen to be a clinical lead or board member for an ICB that goes through the solo route. So we can explain them in detail depending on who's actually on the call when we come to that. And then finally, the locum work. So we'd said earlier on, this is what we've paid over already through to NHS England's bank account, and has been reconciled and matched up anyway to our locum forms. But again, I've been paying these contributions at 9.8%, and because the total tier rate for the year comes to 13.5%, then I'm now left with this shortfall. So in this instance, with locum contributions, then it's down to me as the GP to make that shortfall payment to NHS England. So I use the same bank account that I make the locum payments to for the months that I've locumed, but there's a shortfall template that we have on the PCSE website. So I'm submitting this form online, but when I make the payment to NHS England's bank account, which would be 384.80 in this instance, then there's a shortfall template that I need to complete to submit to PCSE currently through the Contact Us form, with the BACS reference, with the details to say it is for 23-24, it's a locum shortfall, this is me, here's my details, I've already submitted the form, or I'm submitting it online. And then when that payment comes through, every week PCSE get a list of transactions from NHS England. So once we get notified of that payment's been made, match up to that shortfall template and say, okay, it's a shortfall for Dr. X. We get that adjustment processed against the GP's record, and that then brings the locum element of the contributions up to date. And the solo is, as I say, dependent on the type of solo work. So depending on the portfolio of different roles that you have as a type 2 GP, then there can be these various elements to take into account. If you are purely, or have been purely, a salaried GP in a practice, then you can forget all of that we've been talking about in relation to solo and locum, and all you're going to have is this one row, or two rows if it's two different practices, and all you're going to need to think about is, what does your payslip say is the total pensionable pay for the year? What does the payslip say is the total employee contributions you've paid? You're completing these boxes. The system will do the calculation in 2B for you. The system will pull through automatically the figure into 2C, and then the adjustments against the practice will be made automatically once this form is processed, and you will take the figure and the information that's calculated in 2B to discuss with the practice any shortfall or overpayment that's been made as a result of the estimate. Because even if I'd paid on the correct tier rate, then if my income turns out to be different for the practice compared to the estimate, which it can be even just slightly, then it can sometimes tip you into a different tier rates bracket, and you can still be left with a little bit of a shortfall or overpayment. So it's just worth bearing that in mind. That's what these figures all mean. So we get to the summary line, and you don't really need to think much more about the rest of it unless you have an added years contract. So we get the total line that totals everything up. And if you have an AVC that's not added years or a money purchase, then NHS pensions require that you record the amount of AVCs that are due to be paid. So if you've had an AP1 contract and it's got a monthly instalment of a certain percentage, then your overall amount goes into box 7. Employer contributions that have been paid auto-populate in the system, and the total pensionable pay currently populates in box 8 as well. So if somebody does have added years contract, then these figures will also auto-populate. The tier rate is displayed again. There's a row for any earnings from a Welsh Health Board, and then we've got some total rows that are more for PCSE's benefit than anything that you need to be overly concerned about. So your main area to focus on really would be row 2. Any solo and locum would be 3, 4, 5, and then if we've got AVCs added years, then you need to look at that too. But once you've got the correct tier rate selected, then and you've entered the figures from your pay slips, then you're pretty much done. So it's really kind of doing as much of it as it can for you, and then all you need to do really is click submit. The only one other thing I wanted to mention is, I don't know if there's anybody on the webinar this evening who has been type 1 for part of the year and type 2 for the rest of the year, vice versa. The tier rate, I think I mentioned earlier, is determined from your total practitioner income. So that includes any type 1 income as well. So that's why there's a box 1. There's not the A, B and C, because the contributions that you've paid or are due to pay are all calculated on a type 1 form. So if you've been a type 1 and a type 2 GP in the same year, then unfortunately NHS pensions require that you complete both a type 1 and a type 2 form. But for the purposes of the type 2 form and getting the correct tier rate, then this box 1, you would enter the actual profit share figure from your type 1 calculation, so that when it comes to box 6, then that is then totaled to include box 1, and that's, we said earlier, that's the figure that we use to determine our tier rate. So it's just worth bearing that in mind if you have had both types of employment. So all we need to then do is save and next. Okay. And we've got all of the standard wording on the declaration. So this exactly mirrors what's on the paper form that you see on the NHS Pensions website. So we check that everything is, that we can honestly declare and confirm. And once we've done that, then we tick to confirm. That will auto-populate with the date that I'm completing this form, and then all we need to do is submit. Now what you'll then see is that you have a print button. So if you want to print the form or just to save it as a document, then if you click the print button, you'll be able to then get that saved to your local drive and then print it at your leisure. So I'm just going to stop sharing there and just see whether or not we've got any questions. So Alice, hi Alice, you've said I was a registrar trainee until August 23, so unclear if I include this. So I think probably you popped that in just at the start. So hopefully you picked up from what I was saying. So registrar posts are treated as officer posts by NHS pensions, so they don't go through PCSE, so you don't include that in your type 2 account. And I think you've said it yourself, it's not actually on your PCSE Online employee contribution statement, so that's correct that it's not there. It's administered separately by the lead employer for your trainee area. So your PCSE administration, if you like, only starts from the point when you became a salaried GP or you started to do solo work, whatever your circumstances. So we don't include a registrar post, and it sounds like if you were a registrar until August, you'll need to annualise. So hopefully you picked that up from the annualisation bit. So the annualisation calculator is on the NHS Pensions website. Was the deadline for 23-24? Was February deadline for 23-24? Yes, so it was. NHS Pensions set the deadline every year. It usually is the 28th of February, and it's the 28th of February for the previous full pension year. So come 28th of February 26 will be the deadline for the 24-25 forms. The 24-25 forms, the forms are normally published in the autumn. There's been for various reasons, things have been later or different to normal in some of the recent years, but we're expecting the Type 2 form to be published by NHS Pensions in October this year for 24-25, and we are working with our developers and the development schedule and all the other changes that NHS England need PCSE to make to the system across PCSE to try and get the Type 2 form scheduled to go live on PCSE Online in October too. So that would give you lots of time between then and February. But watch this space a bit later in the year for confirmation of that. But just going back to the 23-24, if you haven't done it already, then currently there isn't a penalty like there is for if we're late with our tax returns or anything like that. So not all GPs prioritise or are in circumstances where they manage to do it for the February deadline, and at the moment you're not penalised for that, but yeah, you're encouraged to do it by the deadline, and that's so that you can get your pension record up to date, really, because what I haven't mentioned so far is that once things have been reconciled by PCSE and processed to our side, then all of that information needs to be added to the NHS pension system, because even if it's beautifully reconciled and processed here on PCSE Online and all approved and all of that, if it's not been added to the NHS pension system, then you won't see it on your pension statement or your pensions record at that end. Now, if it's successfully processed by PCSE and your record's already up to date, then we automatically, it's not an automatic system to system thing, but the agent automatically logs into the Pensions Online, or POL system as they like to call it, and gets all of that data in there, so it gets added to your record. But some of you might be aware that the NHS pension system can only be updated in sequential year order. So if anybody's been in a situation where, and it could have been something like 2019-20, if they had maybe moved about different roles and it was difficult to get the information and get your form reconciled, or maybe even there's a year that you didn't manage to get it completed and submitted, even if all of the years after that, you can see on PCSE Online that you've got approved certificates or Type 2 forms, because of that gap here, PCSE are unable to update your actual pension record any further than where that gap arose. So if you do see on the listing screen that you've got any gaps, then, and you haven't, you've not recently submitted that kind of historic form to us, then, I would encourage you to get all that information together and submit the form, because then we would be able to resolve your gap and bring your record right up to date. Okay, so that's the deadline and the schedule stuff. In the financial year section of the T2 form, the drop down for select financial year is empty and I'm unable to process. So what that normally indicates is that we don't have Type 2 contributions on record for you for the year, and there'll be a number of reasons for that. But what I would suggest that you do initially is go to the employee contribution statement button if you've not already done that. Select 23-24 on there, and I would expect to not see any monthly salary contributions for you on there, because if there was, I would expect your drop down on the Type 2 screen to be working, if you like, or visible. Now, the reason that you end up in a situation where we don't have monthly salary contributions for you takes us all the way back to when a GP starts at a practice. When a GP starts at a practice or starts at a new practice, then currently the process is you go to your performer list section on your on PCSE Online when you log in, and you go to the employment changes section there, and you fill out the screen that says I started at practice X on a particular date as a salaried GP. As a salaried GP, then that requires, once you've clicked submit on that, the practice then gets a notification, and that requires the practice user to log in and confirm that Dr. X did start at X practice on this date. And then when they've done that, on that performer list section, then the practice then can go to the pension section and complete what's called the pensions joiner for the GP to say, right, okay, selecting the GP that started on, 1st of, say, July 23 or whatever, and this is the estimated income. And it's that triggers the pension contributions to be deducted from the practice, and that you then start to see monthly contributions on your employee contribution statement. So it can be done retrospectively, and depending on how long ago it was that the GP started, then sometimes it needs some manual intervention by PCSE as well. But that certainly sounds like the scenario there. So speak to the practice, check your employee contribution statement first, speak to the practice, look into your performer list area on PCSE Online and check that you're showing as attached to the practice, or if you have submitted that change, is it still pending? If it's still pending, speak to the practice. If it's been approved, if it's showing you as attached to the practice, speak to the practice about the pension joiner. And once you've done all of that, then it'll be plain sailing for the years thereafter, but that first year can be a bit bumpy if people haven't done things in a timely fashion. On which payslip can I find the totals? Is it the March payslip? Yes. So what the financial folk call the month 12 payslip, so it would be your March payslip. The pension year runs from the 1st of April to the 31st of March, so it's not quite the same as the financial year, but it's the month 12 payslip, so that's a straightforward one. Annualisation is my favourite subject. Hope it's not a hard question. So calculating tier rate. I'm away for 2 continuous months abroad. Is this regarded as a gap? I only have type 2 rules. So yes, I mean, you have to put in the start, end date, start, end date into the calculator to come up with that. It doesn't always affect the tier rate depending on, how much the income is and how big the gap is, but you need to do that to make sure you've got the correct tier rate. The only caveat to that is if you have a solo role, I don't know if you do, but if you do have a solo role and you've got a continuous employment contract, then even if you only do occasional sessions in that role, then the BMA had it clarified with NHS pensions that, and I think it's there in the guidance somewhere, that makes you not subject to annualisation. So check on that if you've got a solo role. If it's a continuous employment contract, then you don't need to annulise. But if you've worked at a practice, been away, and contributions will have stopped, they'll then need to join you again, a couple of months later when you're back again, then that's when you would need to annulise. Payslip's very confusing. Where would it state pensionable pay? I'm looking at March 24 payslip. Is that correct? So it's correct, Alice. It's the March pensionable pay. I'm probably not qualified to give you any advice on your payslip, I'm afraid, but I don't know if you're a BMA member or anything like that, but those sorts of organisations can give you member help on that. Sorry, I don't mean to be unhelpful. We've got to be careful about not advising on things that we're not qualified to do. And then we've got someone who is doing out of hours solo and university. So university doesn't go in form and it's not calculated in the rate, so that's correct. How's the university work determined and is independent to the form solo work? We'd have 2 different rates. So your university post will be treated as officer work. You'll have a payroll department there who will look after all of that. So any queries about how tier rates and things are determined for your university post, then if you speak to them about that, because again, PCSE are only involved in and kind of able to advise on the practitioner posts. So your practitioner work, you've got out of hours solo, which is a practitioner post, and you need to declare that on your type 2 form. And if you don't do any other practitioner post, then it'll be your tier rate will be based purely on your out of hours post. It does feel a bit confusing. It feels a bit confusing to me, but that's a regulation rule that, again, is just how the pensions administration works. So I just treat it as a fact. So I've seen accountants advertising that they can complete the Type 2 forms for me to ensure it's correct. How can they do this without logging into our PCSE account? So the accountants can get access, your practice user administrator can give them access to be able to submit on PCSE Online for you. And I don't know, for all accountants firms, but often when they talk about being able to do it for you, then they will do it on the Excel form that NHS Pensions produce. But some accountants firms do log into PCSE Online and complete the form. What happens then is they can't submit it straight through. It then comes to you to do the confirmation step. So if you've if you have got a firm who says they're doing it on PCSE Online, then just ask them to talk you through it, really. If you get them to calculate the financial side for you so that you make sure everything else that you want to understand about your finances is looked after, actually doing the keying on PCSE Online, as you've just seen from me there, is dead easy if they give you the figures on on the Excel version, so you can do that easily yourself. How do you know if a solo role is continuous? I'm an appraiser in a solo role. Just check with the region, Louise, as the employer. I believe that the NHS England appraisers will be continuous, but again, just check with your employer on that. It's rather than kind of being employed on a sessional basis, but check the terms with them. Do we get notified if we've made any errors after submitting, and if so, is it easy to rectify? So that's a great question, Kate, because I haven't really talked about that, I don't think. So when I submitted that form there, then the next thing that happens is there's a manual intervention by PCSE. Now, on an annual basis, there's just short of 40,000 GP pension scheme members that need to submit forms, and some people need to submit more than one because they've been Type 1, Type 2, etc. When you think about that peak processing window, if everybody was to submit them by the deadline, which not absolutely everybody does, but if they did, and we get a window of another deadline of a date in June by NHS Pensions to get the processing done for all the ones that are received in May. So it does mean that there can be several weeks, there can be 2, 3, 4 months before we would get to the tail end of that really big seasonal spike within the realms of what NHS Pensions kind of set for PCSE as the boundaries. Then when you get into kind of later on in the year, if somebody's submitted after that February deadline, the PCSE team kind of start picking them up after that June window's passed. And so again, there's a several month lag there. So that aside, once the PCSE agent has looked at the form, if it can't be approved, then when you go to the listing screen, you'll see that it says status is rejected, and when it's rejected, you've got a little hover button, and that will tell you the rejection reasons, and then it's then quite straightforward. You're then able to log in, take the form back to draft. There's a little icon that you click on to take it back to draft, update it, and then resubmit it. So it is really easy to do, and I think we've got a video already on the website showing you how to do that. But if you've got your employee contribution statement data and you've checked that everything is fine there, then we shouldn't get any instances where we need to reject it, really. And then I think we've got a follow-up question about the financial year. So you should be able to select the solo organisation in the Type 2 screen.
Okay, so we just wanted to end. I know we've gone through a couple of slides on how it works in PCSE Online. There is a lot of videos on the PCSE YouTube channel. If you want to head over to that, like I said, the videos range from 5 minutes, 2 minutes. They are really easy to watch, but I just wanted to let you know about that. We do have a lot of information available on the website as well, and I believe we are in the process of updating the user guide for Type 2 to allow submissions via PCSE Online.
Thank you. Thanks for joining, everybody. Thanks for the questions, and good luck with PCSE Online. Thank you.